Welcome back to Money Matters. I'm again joined by David Kroll, and we are talking about trends that we're seeing in the market and how it impacts your financial plan. And earlier in the show, we were talking, as we've always discussed, a lot about movements in interest rates, movements in the markets, and we discussed how we're seeing that impacting more the baby boomer generation, the 50s and 60s. And I have seen a lot of interesting, somewhat anecdotal evidence in articles recently, specifically about the Gen X generation and what the recession did to them. Gen X, as I've seen it defined, is about 1966 to maybe 1980. I'm smack dab in the middle of it.
Right.
And so those that are sort of in their 40s, late 30s. And what most of the articles were saying is that that generation actually got hit perhaps the hardest during the Great Recession of 2007 through 2009 because they have not been able to regain their earnings power. And they will be the first generation to actually not live at a higher standard or live as well as their parents' generation did. And they're really not, most analysts, economists are not seeing that particular generation come back. They're not getting the jobs, they're not getting the increases in their salaries that had been experienced in previous generations. The equity isn't in the homes anymore. They're not moving up into larger homes. What are you seeing in that generation? Are you seeing that to be true here? And what do you think the broader impact of that is?
It's very interesting, and I hope the Gen X people who are watching the show don't sort of take hemlock or take the gas.
It put fear in my mind for sure.
But what happened was that age group absolutely were buying their first real homes and making their first real investments at the height of the market, and doing so with very little money down.
Right.
So we were happily financing them, and they were buying $200,000 and $300,000 and $400,000 homes with 5% down, 0%
on a credit card.
down.
On a credit card.
On a
5% down on a credit card.
And maybe a small gift from family, and those homes depreciated by 25–30%.
Right.
They weren't, as you said correctly say, they weren't at the height of the earnings curve, not nearly.
They were in more the middle management, earlier on in the earnings
early on in their careers,
right.
and so when it hit, it just completely knocked them off their feet. The highest number of personal bankruptcies that I've seen in this area, not actual going to the lawyer and filing bankruptcy necessarily, but de facto personal bankruptcies, just basically lost everything, has come in that group. Because the older group, my group, the baby boomers, some of them fell into that category because they bought $200,000 houses when they should have stayed put in a $600,000 house.
Now, is it more difficult, though, for somebody in that category in that age group, the higher age group, to declare bankruptcy because they actually have more assets versus somebody, in their late 30s, early 40s? If they were that far underwater, they probably don't have the assets sitting on the side. It's easier for them to actually declare bankruptcy and wipe it out.
It is easier to declare bankruptcy, or it's easier to give up and start again for your group than it is for my group.
I'll tell you though, I still see, and I've had a lot of conversations with folks in my age group, in late 30s, early 40s, mid 40s, that they are so averse to declaring bankruptcy because they're afraid of the 10 years after that it's going to be on their credit report, versus folks that are in their 60s say, I'm not going to buy another house. I've got my house that I want right now. I have my 401k. I want to go ahead and clean this up. Versus in their 40s, they say, well, then I'll never be able to buy another house, even though it was the house that put them under in the first place.
That's right.
They'd rather sit with a judgment. And what is your thought on that? I mean, we're taking this in a different direction here.
We're taking it in a different direction, but it's really, again, what's the plan?
Right.
And if you find yourself impossibly boxed in with
you need to keep looking.
Exactly. With a set of conditions that just won't work, then you need a plan. And the plan is bankruptcy, not technically necessarily, but in effect. And there's 100 approaches to it. There's 100 attitudes about it. People stay stuck for a year or 2 years or 3 years.
But at least there's forward. I guess I have the opinion that they have to move forward, and you're not going to be able to move forward if you're sitting with that juggernaut on your back. And
The unpleasant part of the conundrum here is that bankruptcy puts you in a position, especially a Chapter 13 bankruptcy, in which you pay off a percentage to the creditors.
The workout versus the wipeout.
Right, the workout bankruptcy puts you in a position to borrow money again a year later.
Really? See, now that is not
And
what
Chapter
most...
7 bankruptcy, which wipes out all the debt, that's 5 to 7 years later.
To be able to
borrow
borrow
again.
anything?
Well, to borrow
For a home?
for a home. Yeah.
Really? Now, what about, but sitting with the judgment, basically, how does that impact? If you sit with a $300,000-400,000 judgment on your back, then...
With the judgment, you until the judgment's gone, you cannot borrow.
And when do those fall off? 10 years. So you're speeding up your ability to move on financially, and also having the clarity of knowing that the judgment's not actually going to be forced on you.
That's exactly correct.
You know, which is...
What bankruptcy is a decision to move forward into the future. It's not the stain, it's not the tattoo. It's the decision to move forward.
Right.
And
when put in that light.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It truly is. But the Gen Xers, your group, really got hammered because they also had very little to lose.
Right.
Their retirement accounts were very small. They were mid-management, the quickest people to be cut.
And let's talk about that for just a second in terms of, that the overall theme being focusing on the plan and the long-term plan. I have seen a lot of folks, and it's not so much anymore, but really, it was at its height, I'd say probably 2010, 2009, 2010, the end of the Great Recession, if you will, that people were bleeding their IRAs and their 401ks, taking the tax hit, taking the penalties to cover their various debts. And oftentimes real estate debt, maybe investment real estate debt, something like that. And I would beg them not to, because for those of you who don't know, those are protected assets. Those retirement assets are protected, meaning your creditors, if you go through bankruptcy, cannot jump in to those assets. So unless there is, and I would always just beg them, if there was a plan, if using these funds coming out of a 401k or an IRA were going to be used for, say, a 60-day period, and we knew that there was a light at the end of that 60-day period, okay, maybe back off a little bit, but if there wasn't, then keep those funds there. And don't
touch them.
Don't touch them, because that plan, you're still going to retire. Whether you have the house or you don't have the house, you're still going to hit 65, 70, 75, and maybe you don't retire, but you certainly physically will have to be paring back at some point in time. And even with the fabulous modern medicine, and I think that's a great point to be made, is always looking at that, the long-term plan, even when you're, looking at, say, a bankruptcy and tapping your retirement assets.
You don't tap the retirement assets. You just don't do it. The impulse to do it is to be a good Boy Scout, good Girl Scout, and meet the current obligations no matter what it takes. No, not absolutely.
Having some boundaries.
You have to set that boundary, and that's the toughest thing. To be in the position of counseling somebody, to stop at that point and to say, okay, lost the battle, I have to start again. Just shy of those retirement assets. Yeah.
Some other sort of anecdotal and also economic data that's come out recently that is a little bit troubling is when you consider the nervousness in the market right now, and the fact that, as you had said earlier, that there's a lot of bubbles. There's bubbles in, you're seeing, they're feeling that there's maybe some bubbles in, in bonds, some bubbles in real estate, perhaps in the equity markets, certainly, across the board, across all sectors. But what's interesting is, even with that nervousness, what numbers have been really positive recently, or pretty positive? Retail sales.
It's amazing.
Yes. So that means that the consumer is actually out there buying right now, which that makes me a little bit more nervous. It makes me feel positive about the fact that there's money flowing, in the economy. But by the same token, that's not necessarily the best use of funds. And here we are going into summer, not necessarily going into back to school or Christmas or anything like that, where you typically are looking at those numbers. And
deeply ingrained in our culture is this is the most advanced consumer culture in the world.
There's some that are trying to catch us, though, fast and furious. China's right
China's
there.
trying to learn how to do it.
Yep.
But the American consumer, having been denied and having self-denial for 4 or 5 years, says, gosh darn it,
yeah.
we ought to be able to take a vacation this summer.
And we're heading to the outlets.
And we're going to go to the outlets. If we can't go to Europe, we can certainly go to the outlets.
But also, interestingly, we have really low oil prices right now. Airline stocks are also very, very positive right now, which of course is a sign that whether you're seeing the retail traveler or the business traveler flying, they're flying, and car sales have been very strong. And there's just a lot of signs
but
that
incomes have not grown.
Exactly.
So where's the money coming from?
Savings rates have increased somewhat, but lackluster. Yeah.
So there's no money to fuel a big consumer boom, but there is greater consumption. So that's kind of a mini bubble too.
Right. That's true.
I think.
So in summary, I guess what we'd say is that there is that nervous energy in the market right now, and it's possible that it could start pulling us back in to some of what we experienced in the past 3 years. It will repeat itself possibly, and that definitely makes us a little bit nervous. But the end point is constantly looking down the road, because had you not invested your funds 3 years ago when we first started hearing about Europe and the debt situation that we have here in the States, you would have missed one of the biggest run-ups that we've had in history over the last 3 years. So don't necessarily give in to the nervous energy, sort of look past it to what's most important to you and how you get there.
Exactly.
Right. All right.
I like it.
Great.
Yes.
Well, thank you very, very much for joining me today.
I
I appreciate it. Thank you for joining us. We look forward to seeing you next week. Please keep shooting us your ideas. We love hearing from you. Check us out on Facebook. Shoot me an email, and look forward to seeing you next week. I am Emily Johnson, and this has been Money Matters.